Thank you, everybody, thank you for inviting Magic Leap and our team today. Jennifer's going to join us in a little bit we're going to kind of do a fireside chat. I'm going to give you just an introduction into what we do, spatial computing, and how it might impact healthcare of the next, think of it as like 2 years, 5 years, and 10 years. So probably, in the next decade of your life, stuff like this is going to show up either immediately or at some point soon. Before we get going, I just want to show you a little bit something where we've created a digital human being that interacts with other people with empathy. So it's one of our projects is about how do AIs embody in the world, but not act like they have like part of their brain missing, but how does an AI act like with awareness and empathy? So it's a project we have called Micah, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But here's kind of a little piece of that. It's actually pretty amazing. One of the things visitors to Magic Leap do is they come to like a living room area, they sit down, they meet her. She takes a few minutes to get to know you, and then you co-create a piece of art together. So she makes an original piece of artwork with you. And one of the things we're testing is how people will react with AIs who fully sense you and understand your state of mind. They understand your focus, your concentration. Are you stressed out? Are you not stressed out? So we started on the EQ part of AI, which we think is going to be really interesting in the future of medicine. And I'll keep referring to Micah at different parts of the talk. Whoops. A little bit about like what we mean by spatial computing. So sort of a big picture, a little bit to think about. Part of what we see coming is a merger of two worlds, the physical and the digital world. You already have that a little bit. You have your computer in your hand, your mobile phone, but in the operating room, in hospital setting, in home settings, computing hasn't hit everybody yet in the way it should. And there's probably about 2 billion people around the world that work with their hands. They're not sitting behind the desk. They're not typing. Nurses and doctors are definitely that. And computing has not penetrated in the same way. It doesn't provide the same utility as it could. And we're looking at a way for those things to really completely come together. And I think of that as spatial computing. And an even bigger notion is this idea of the spatial web. So the 2D internet, which everyone knows about, it's kind of at its peak. You know, like you have a phone, you're on Instagram, Facebook, you're streaming Netflix. That's all 2D web. Amazon is 2D web. The spatial web is we're in a room and computing is on the wall, it's flat. It doesn't really permeate everything like the physical world does. And what we're talking about is where digital and physical really come together. So we built a roadmap of 2020 to 2030. Kind of the first thing we put out, which we call the ML1, it's like our Tesla Roadster or like the Apple One computer. It's like our very first way to understand what is spatial computing. And what's interesting about it is it senses the environment, it senses you. It has like a baby Jarvis computer vision processor. You see the world directly. It's not through a video display. And we had to go through great pains. We built a factory here in Florida that blends digital information with visual light field information. So the real world and digital so that your brain perceives both blended together as real. So you're not in a synthetic environment. You see the world like I see you, but digital things are also there and they sit in the world properly. One of the things that we learned from the one is all kinds of things about what people liked and didn't like We're now in production on the 2, which is much smaller, much lighter, a gigantic field of view, much more powerful sensing, and kind of like an AI processor that I think of like a real Jarvis. You have more like real Iron Man capability, and we'll talk about what that means. And it's really about your relationship with people, the environment, and technology. And one of the things we like to differentiate is like, a lot of you are familiar with virtual reality, where you are completely blocked from the world. It's like sticking a screen in front of your face and you're in this synthetic world. We don't do that. I think some of the issues with that is it's so synthetic and so disconnected from the physical environment. And then you go to the real world, it's like 2 different places. It can also make you dizzy. There's a lot of interesting reports on VR because of the sensory input issues. The visual information is not what the eye-brain system is really used to getting. The sensory information that your vestibular system is used to getting is not really well locked. VR's got like phase lag with it, so you feel dizzy and disconnected. So when you're training or doing things, we found about 1/3 of men and almost 2/3 of women feel nauseous. You're in it for a certain amount of time, you feel nauseous, you feel weird. Some universities have 1 minute in VR, 1 minute off, because it's a signal that your brain really isn't used to getting. So it has a number of issues. Even though it has a lot of interesting utility, the way it's embodied today, it's got some problems. What we think of as AR, a lot of people are familiar with it. I see that mostly as like when you hold up your phone or a tablet. And I think of that as like the coach seat way to do spatial computing. Like, it wasn't ever designed to do it, but you can use your phone to kind of perceive the world, and you're looking through a video display, and you get this peek into a world that you would like to actually see directly, but it's not really that way. And if you're a nurse or a doctor, this kind of sucks. Then you might build something where you're holding over your head, but you're really not like this. You don't have both hands free. You're not really able to do stuff. Plus, it's not fully aware. It's got like a couple sensors that were never designed to do real spatial computing, but it is not a bad way to sort of look into that future. So I see it as like a gateway into something, probably a bad metaphor. It's like the gateway drug to spatial computing. And then spatial computing is like your hands free, you see the world properly, visual and physical and digital information are blended together in a way that's neurologically, physiologically correct. And it senses you and senses the environment simultaneously. So it's a really different kind of computing platform. And we think that's what the next probably 10, 20, even 30 years are all about. And you'll see computing shift on many fronts in this direction. And part of it is like, we think of it as like freedom from screens, but it's sort of like one initial step forward. And a lot of the way you get computing information today, there's like carts with monitors and all kinds of stuff that's beeping everywhere. And you're like, patient, I'm looking over here, and this other thing is beeping. So we need that information coming from computing, but it's presented in an awkward way on ideas that were really 70s ideas. It's an era of computing that would really worked, but never really considered people working in space, people in the field, combat medics, nurses being in an operating room. It was never really built for that kind of environment. So what we think of spatial computing in healthcare is, how do we amplify the practitioner? I think of that as Tony Starking someone, giving you like Iron Man or Iron Person capabilities, and how do you create new points of care, which is, how can you project yourself in many places at once? We'll sort of talk through that a little bit. So here's a concept that's putting a few things together. One of them is the operating room here, or the healthcare environment, the patient would never be this smiling and happy. So this was for an audience. I gave this talk in Japan about a month ago. They didn't want to see all the blood and guts and stuff. So this was like a little bit sanitized for them. But the operating room would have what we call a digital twin. So there's a platform we're working with total university level, to make a Magicverse, which is a digital copy of a whole space that coexists one-to-one scale in that space. So imagine the operating room is physical, but there's a digital copy that's dynamically updated as well. What you've got here is a clinician who, in this case, is wearing a Magic Leap 1, probably will be using a Gen 2 or Gen 3 at scale. They're both looking at some radiology data. The patient should be asleep. The clinician who's remote has popped in as a remote presence. Now, their ability to understand what's going on could be as fulsome as someone who's there, because they might be receiving the entire environment, IoT information. As that person walks around the room, they may be walking around in a one-to-one relationship in their other environment. So they can have agency. They're not just seeing, but maybe they can turn things on through IoT. They can put their finger on something and say, do this, don't do that. They might see vital information. And then you have a friend here who's using a tablet, kind of the old school way. I would call that XR. So there's a way to kind of still let people with phones and tablets to see what's going on. But the two folks in full spatial computing, they're seeing real world and digital blended in an interesting way together. So the clinician's co-present and you got 3D visualization. I think a really interesting dynamic, and this is something, this is a very simple example, like training someone to do like an Amazon warehouse. Here you have an AI that understands the space. We're actually doing this at our factory. You can come in and avatars walk you around the factory, take you to the kitchen, teach you things. So it's very much like this. And here, an AI is like taking you around. Imagine that could be your instructor and just showing you around the hospital. And as you're doing things, your eyes are their eyes, your senses are their senses. And they are amplified also by an AI backend. So in a networked environment, they're able to use the compute on your pack, but they're also pulling compute, let's say, from the edge and from cloud networks. So you can have an incredibly powerful, omnipresent, let's say, nurse trainer who's always there with you in every situation, who has seen everything, knows everything all the time. So part of this is like, I'm not just training you how to do stuff. In all the situations you're in, whatever you're seeing, imagine an AI helper who also has seen everything, because they can query like the 10,000 other examples that are happening around the world at that moment. They can query databases at super speeds that you can't. And they're using machine learning and vision recognition to say, oh, that's blood, this is the face, these are the eyes. There's a certain amount of objects in the hospital you can completely classify with deep learning machine learning. You can fully understand that. With 5G and gigabit networks, you can then deliver that at like sub 20, sub 10 millisecond latencies, which is like that, back to you so that you and everyone around you could be receiving the same information. So imagine not just you, but all the doctors, other technicians are all in the same environment, seeing the same thing at the same time, all amplified. That's one of the things we're super excited about, where we're amplifying the capabilities of a person, but also a collective, and you could be aware of that collective and the actions of that collective. So it's not just an individual, you can have this like orchestration of a group of AIs and a group of people doing something to sort of reduce error, make sure healthcare is done right, teach people things on the fly that they may not know or may not have seen, but something that sees what you see, that can query infinite databases, might be able to have seen everything that ever came before, unless you're that new anomaly that never ever happened. Now you add that to the sort of rich background. So our whole thing is like, how do you make this training and information available in real time, contextually aware, spatially aware? And that's kind of a big piece of what we're working on the healthcare side. So think of this as practitioner amplification. We'll give you some examples. So here's a radiologist sitting in their office. You have a co-presence coming in, and they might be analyzing 3D information from a patient. And that we know now in radiology that an AI can probably more accurately diagnose certain kinds of tumors much more quickly, much more accurately than probably any human. So it's really a clinician plus some AI and maybe a co-present assistant doing things together. Now here, the clinician and a remote, let's say another remote doctor, they're looking at the entire history. This is actually stuff we have built and have running. You could sit in a room and have like this endless hallway of every single image from that patient. You could like fill this whole building and just walk around the radiology data. You can actually blow up a brain to the size of this auditorium and walk inside it, sit in the tumor, and then unfold every single scan and see what that's like, because you have no limitation on monitors. You just have as much space as you want. So that lets you understand what's going on with imaging in a really interesting way. So here they might say, I found something strange. Let me get a specialist from like Brigham, someone from Jackson, maybe someone from Stanford. Could you all appear? And suddenly these people might appear if you have a good network. And you're suddenly getting expertise to understand something that might have taken days or weeks to try to find that person, get them there, send the information. So we think the idea of like co-presence is super important, because right now we communicate through flat things. Communicating spatially is I could send everything around me to someone else, and they could sort of be present instantly. And that's one of the more powerful things we're working on. And the idea that the clinicians and the remote avatars, and what's interesting is a co-presence could be another person. It could be an AI from the National Institute of Health. It could be a Harvard doctor, and it might slip in and out, because what you might have is an AI is there doing its thing until something really unexpected comes up. And then you have another clinician who might be the world's expert who pops in if there's an issue. So you can think about AI amplifying expertise and holding things down until someone can get there quickly and able to provide amplification and aid to what's going on. What's going on here is like you have the doctor and patient co-presence looking at additional content to figure out, in this case, it's it's a chemotherapy or radiation treatment plan. So one of the things you might be able to do is you're sitting with the patient explaining what's going to happen, and suddenly, here's you, and here's what's going to happen. We've actually done something quite interesting where they turned my office into an operating room. So suddenly, there's the operating room table. Here's all the monitors up here. Here's the patient. It could actually be you in your full body scan lying down there. And you're seeing the whole surgery unfold almost anywhere. So you can take someone through what's going to happen in a kind of a very non-scary way, where they're seeing what you're seeing, and you're seeing it at one-to-one scale. And it's a way to educate. It's also a way to plan. And it's also a way that you might execute. One of the other things is what we think about as new points of care. Our points of care in the hospital. How do you do a lot more things at home and other places? So you have the digital hospital, which I think is going to be super interesting. How do hospitals become places where predictability of outcome is much greater confidence, speed happens with increasing quality, and there's a connected team that understands all the best workflows, because it's not just the local knowledge in that hospital, it's like continuous available knowledge of all AI databases and all information present to you when you need it at the moment you need it. The digital clinic, and again, with the right networks and computing, you can make the care at a clinic become closer and closer to the equivalency, at least from an information or knowledge perspective, what you might have in a digital hospital. And as like things like gigabit networks show up at home, you might be able to bring the same thing to home and have digital health and co-presence also in people's homes. Because often homes where things like they might be neglected, they may not be able to get to the hospital, and the kind of treatments and engagement you might need to give them could be completely important, and they may not be able to get to the hospital. It takes 5 hours, or the remote. The ability that you can have equivalent care on some level, at least informationally, at least contextually, could be very interesting. So here's an example of like everything that's white is physical, and maybe an example of what might be happening in a hospital environment. And the overlays are like how spatial computing might be inserted into a hospital environment. So you might be making visual radiology data come to life. You might have a clinician and patient and a group all looking at interacting with that rich information together as a group. You might have things that are just fun and entertaining. Like you might have an elderly person that needs a companion. That companion may be a robot or a mica, someone that has infinite patience, infinite EQ, can teach you things. It just doesn't need to go anywhere, and everyone can have their own companion who looks like whatever they need to look like, speaks the language they need to speak, and just have as much time. So it's like, hey, I got to go run do something else, but like Bob over here will take care of you for the next 5 hours. And by the way, even at the early stage with Micah, I've had people like spend a long time with her. I'm like, she's not fully plugged into AI yet. And I'm like, no, you can't marry her either. But like we've seen at the very early stages how hard and how deep people react to something that pays attention, makes perfect eye contact, really has empathy, focuses on you. As an artificial entity, it's amazing how people melt within like just a couple seconds. So the EQ part, I think we're seeing some really interesting things going on. Let's keep going here. This is a concept that we talked about with some major retailers. And I think it's really interesting. How do you bring care to maybe not the home, but maybe to a different point of care center? It could be a CVS, a Walgreens, a Walmart. Whatever is white is just an empty box, and you'll notice you have some sensors to create some spatial awareness, and you also have sensors in our device that create spatial awareness. You have one patient in one room and another patient in another room. Everything color would be a digital spatial thing. So suddenly on the left, you see the woman sitting, and let's say this is a co-present doctor or nurse comes in, and they're going through all of her vital signs and doing an entire review that you might only be able to do in a hospital. This is happening in like an empty room, like at a CVS somewhere. It's an empty room with a chair with some sensors, but this entire rich environment is all spatial, but to the patient looks like it's all real. Here you have, let's say this is Dr. Micah or Nurse Micah is meeting with a patient and doing a full exam. And with some sensors and biomarkers on the patient and sensors in the area, we might be able to derive like 80 or 90% of what's important and say, okay, there's something really serious, you got to get to the hospital. Or what you really need is like to change your diet or something from the pharmacy or something else. And you, literally the nurses here, could pop in there, do that, pop back in. You might be someone that doesn't just make rounds at a certain floor. You might be making rounds all over Dade or Broward County, popping in and out with like zero friction in terms of travel through co-presence. And we think that's going to be really interesting, especially where you have rural areas, you have areas where people have a hard time ambulating, getting out of their apartment. And the cost of this will continuously get cheaper. Networks get cheaper, devices will be sort of prices of phones. So the ability to provide this kind of super rich care with like a high-speed network and advanced computing over the next decade, it looks incredibly interesting to increase quality of care, give more people care, and do it at a much better way, because you have some normalizing functions, which is really networks, AI, and computing, where they get better and the costs get lower. Because if you don't intervene, you just have healthcare, which our current trajectory is about $4 trillion GDP globally, and it's gonna like double in the next like maybe 3-4 years. And this year about less than 100 billion of that is tech. So 3.9 trillion is super inefficient use of people's time and resources. And tech has had very little penetration. As much as we think technology is in healthcare, it's like let's say 90 billion over 4 trillion. So there's immense room to make healthcare much more efficient, to make someone much more capable, and use computing to change the trajectory of quality of care and give more people higher quality care. We've even thought about what does a future city look like, and one of the interesting things about the partnership with the University of Miami is it's a microcosm campus. So our goal 2020 through 2030 is how do we do things at UM that might be the kind of things you see in cities or hospitals all over the place. So here you might have like an autonomous driving ambulance that picks you up and becomes a complete, ambulatory center for someone that can't get there. A remote ambulance might just show up, or it's a remote healthcare van. And your full assessment is done with an AI remote presence. And there's not even a person in that, or maybe it's a remote person. You might be just, in general health, like your whole path of like, you got to do 5 miles today. What's your performance? What's your health factors? That bicyclist might be wearing a Magic Leap 4, and every time he or she's eating something, all the calories are detected, the bad food's detected. You really can't cheat it because it sees everything you're doing, and it will tell you at the end of the day, here's the perfect you at perfect body weight, but the you right now is 30% over, you just smoked a cigarette, because it's a way of like providing truth and data and forecasting your life. Like you ate that Big Mac and fries, and it's like your life expectancy just decreased by 4 weeks. You had that bender and everything went down. So there might be too much information, but this is what spatial computing can do. And then you could see this woman here going to the grocery store, and it could be her diet and her optimized food plan just all appears. And things that she should be eating are just shining and awake, and things she shouldn't be eating just get suppressed down based on her physiology and like an entire maybe decade of understanding her medical needs and patterns. So she has a built-in AI nutritionist everywhere she goes, whether she's shopping, whether she's at a restaurant. And then you have an elderly person who might be guided by an AI assistant like a Micah or whatever form they want to get them to somewhere where, again, you have this Boy Scout, Girl Scout that's taking you all over the place, telling you stories, helping you through things. The other part that's interesting is IoT control, so Internet of Things. Software doesn't just appear visually, it could turn on lights, it can open doors, it could summon Ubers and Lyfts for you. What's interesting is it can actually take action in the physical world as well. And what's interesting is we have a concept we call economy X, like how do you have this amplified economy because of spatial computing? And if you think about what Amazon did to bookstores, a bookstore has a finite economy. Amazon had almost an unlimited 2D economy. When you think about a hospital, what you do, you're limited by your physicality and the physical space. Spatial computing gives you a huge amplification power. So I would think if you're a student today or just graduating or just early in your career, in 10 years, you might be 50 or 100x more amplified than you are today. Whereas the last 500 years, you were pretty much 1x, 1.2x. The world's best nurse was maybe a 2x, but you might be 100x in 10 years. And what's interesting is like, how do you learn how to do that? Because you plus this group of technologies will be a much more powerful entity than any other time in human history. So you need to learn how to do that and how to cope with it and how to treat patients a lot better. So this amplification factor is going to come from AI and deep learning, machine learning coming through you, where you become amplified by it. Having like superhuman sensing and machine vision capabilities that see what you see, hear what you hear, understand what you're understanding, and you and that system will have this very intimate dialogue where you become a lot more powerful than you alone or the thing without you. Because computing without you lacks empathy, lacks this full awareness. The human brain is much more sophisticated than any computing probably for the next 100 years. So that combination is really interesting. And I think what's good is that if you learn how to meld those two together, you become an incredibly interesting and powerful entity in medicine. And a little bit about some of the numbers to think about. So US healthcare spend in 2018, 3.3 trillion. So this really matters, and our inefficiency is out of control, and our quality of care is, like, in some places great, but across the whole country, it's unbelievable. I will say something political here. If you're going to do healthcare for everyone, if you don't bring in computing and networks, you're completely insane. If you do, you can actually reduce the cost and everyone can have great healthcare because you're introducing a technological factor with people that can actually make it incredibly good. Everyone can have it. So it's really not a politics problem. It's a medicine and engineering problem where you can actually cut that and make it better and less cost. So I think you have a big role there. Global healthcare by 2020, $10 trillion, which is unbelievable. This is like a huge problem, and you're right in the middle of it, and without any kind of technology intervention, it's just this out of control runaway thing that's a problem. 4.3 million people short globally who are healthcare professionals. I think nurses are on the front line of that, and you're going to be asked to do a lot more. And if you have no support and no extra tech, how do you do that? So kind of what we talked about today is like there's an amplification factor where you can do the work of 10 people. Maybe you're already doing that, so we'll help you do the work of 100 people. But without some help, you're just going to like get stressed out and burn out, and you won't sleep. So how do you stay healthy? You know, like a high performance athlete, you need gear, you're going to need amplification, and that's part of what we're trying to help you do. And 2% of that spend, I was talking about the small sliver, is on tech. So you have all this work, there's all this inefficient money going on, and very little engineering tech intervention in the way that it's needed. So I think there's like a crazy opportunity for anyone who's a practitioner or anyone engineering to actually make a dent here, because you can't get to healthcare for everyone if that stays true. Because without some kind of intervention, it's just everything that's going on made worse with more people who have more diseases and more epidemics going on. But what's interesting is 5 billion people have a mobile smart connected device. In 10 years, it's probably turned over to those people who have some kind of spatial computing device. So in that transition, that next decade, it's going to be really interesting. In the 20 years, like if you look at 2030, 2040, it's probably a really interesting and completely different period of time. But the transition from now to 2030 will be bumpy, but a chance for someone to be a pioneer and shift whole ways of thinking in your hospital and your community. And then just kind of like, we think the reality of what you do is just beginning. So I'll stop there, and we're going to do, I think, a Q&A. Thank you.